with my family.
Oh, nice. Thank you for joining us. All right, everyone, thank you for being here. Before we get started, I'm going to go around the room and get speaking positions, so please let me know who's speaking in what order, and if you have a pronoun preference, then would be a great time to let me know. So, opening government.
I'm Marco. I'm replacing Glenn Scahill, and he, him, his.
I'm second.
Sorry. Do you happen to know if people have been writing your name down as Marco or Glenn in the tab?
They've been writing down Marco.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries. I'm second speaker, Helena Ong, and she, her, hers.
Okay. Opening off.
Genevieve will be speaking first, Haley speaking second, no preference.
Closing gov.
I will be speaking first, no preference.
And closing off.
Robert first, John second, no preference.
All right, everyone. My name is Corey. I will be your chair. Could I ask one of you folks to timekeep for me, please? Cool. Then I'll allow my wings to introduce themselves.
Devin?
Yep.
Jaden?
Jacob? He is.
And I think Devin will do the timekeeping.
I think that was four.
Oh, you're four? Oh, I.
Can anyone do time?
You can?
That's just the clap.
Yeah. All right, so this Jacob will be timekeeping for you. We have two, so this one. All right, without any further ado, I call this house to order, and I invite the Prime Minister to give a speech not to exceed 7 minutes and the motion before us.
In this debate, I would like to break down some of the fundamental dichotomies that will be presented between knowledge, science, and art. And in order to do so, I will be first breaking down the motion in the most explicit terms and try and present a reasonable, fair model to understand how this debate should proceed from this point onwards. So we're going to assume that this test that's presented to us in this theoretical world is 100% accurate and does not make errors. I think that's the only fair way to interpret the kind of information that this test would be generated. And so what has to therefore be weighted up here is both which side would benefit society the most and which side would also benefit the individual, the gifted scientific individual the most. And we shall show that on both counts, opening government will take this debate. To also clarify a few terms even further, when we say will become a scientist, this is assuming that there is free will in making this action. We don't think that there's any language in the motion that suggests that this is being done against this individual's will. And furthermore, that becoming a scientist means someone who studies science and practices science in their career in a meaningful fashion. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're explicitly a PhD academic, but it could be someone that uses science very heavily, for example, in a business practice. So first of all, I think one of the most obvious points to make is that if this individual is predicted to be one of the greatest scientific minds of all time or currently alive, it makes sense that the kind of scientific work that they would be doing should they become a scientist and say they pursue research and a PhD in science, for example, would make a huge significance to understanding the physical world around us. You know, like, there's a reason why we revere so highly the kinds of people that win Nobel Prizes, not simply because that they're just intelligent people and this is a prize that just recognizes the fact that they have a high degree of intelligence, but also that their knowledge is specifically highly useful to not just the country from which they're from, but also the entire world, which is why it pulls on such a diverse body of people each year when a Nobel Prize for Science is rewarded. As an example, I believe last year or the year before, there was a team of Japanese scientists that got recognition for developing nanotubes, which allows for an incredible development in science in terms of microtechnology and small-scale technology. We can see that it's quite evident and obvious, therefore, that if someone had a fantastic scientific brain and they pursued it, for example, in this case, in academic research, that academic research inherently then becomes more accessible to the world and can be used not just by other academics in understanding our physical realities, but also in developing technologies, for example, and being implemented in business. And my partner will expand perhaps a little bit on the business aspect. But I would also like to draw on this idea of passion, because in the prompt we presented the idea that passion, this individual that's scientifically gifted has a passion for art. And I'd like to argue that passion is fundamentally malleable in a way that this kind of scientific gift is not. I'll take your point before I...
Okay, so is the scientific advance of knowledge inherently a good thing? Let's say the scientist becomes a marine biologist and learns something really, really cool about blue whales. Is that necessarily so great for society?
I think that this kind of POI is kind of not super related to the debate itself, because it just questions whether the expansion of knowledge is a good thing. I think that's something that we can kind of take for granted, especially because that kind of knowledge you're talking about, it deals with endangered animals, and I think that collectively we as humans would want to understand how to preserve and best care for those kinds of animals and make sure that they continue to exist in the future. I don't know that we should really be relegating hierarchies of knowledge. Like if someone is going to do cutting edge in any kind of science, I think that that's a good thing. Anyway, back to my second point of the debate, and I'm going to present to you 3 points. One was the first, that science, the scientists will create a massive shift in society. Passion is malleable. It's not something that is necessarily assigned to you at birth. The idea that you just have this inner passion somewhere and you just have to unlock it, it's been exposed to be a fallacy. You know, passion actually can be developed when you find something that you are good at and that you continue to work at it and practice it regularly. That is how passion actually is defined, or how we identify passions. They're activities that we know that we do, we become good at them, we become effective at them, and we practice them over time. So this idea that the calling of this individual is only for art and that science cannot be excluded, I think is premised on this kind of logic that passion cannot change over time. But also, what is important here to recognize is the fact that we assume that this person who has great scientific aptitude, when they take this aptitude test, has that innately. So that's something which will not be malleable or change over time. It's something that will carry forward because the test has 100% accuracy and it predicted that this person will be one of the best scientists in society. Thirdly, we'd like to break down the dichotomy itself. I'll take your POI then.
Okay, so passion is malleable, but how does that account for the fact that many people have been doing jobs for 15, 20, 30 years and are still incredibly depressed? They did it for a very long time, they didn't necessarily become passionate.
And the great thing about this is that this specifically scientifically gifted individual can still practice art even within the kinds of study that they do. Be that with business and combining the kinds of scientific knowledge they acquire with the kind of arts to develop an interesting product, or simply practice art on the side. It's not fair to say that someone can only occupy the mindset of a scientist, commit to the path of a scientist, and therefore no longer appreciate art or be able to create art in the way that I believe side opposition will present to you throughout this entire debate. Let's think of some of the most famous scientists, like Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance man. Why not bring back that idea, have a Renaissance woman or a Renaissance non-gender binary person, and why not bring that idea back, that there's actually a mesh and a relationship between practicing art and science. We live in a time when the idea is that this kind of knowledge is inherently polarized, that there's no overlap, that there's nothing that can be generated from being gifted in both of those things, or being passionate about both of those things, or even passionate about one of those things and gifted in the other one. From my own college, my college president, she studies the neuroscience of poetry, how we react line by line, how our brains react chemically line by line to each line of poetry. And I think there's an incredibly promising field in which someone could even overlap the kinds of scientific knowledge that they've developed and expand that with the humanities and expand that with the arts. There's no reason why we should treat them as sort of binary commitments, that you pursue one and you leave the other one behind. And if we have someone who's both the most scientifically gifted person in the world, who also has a passion for art, imagine the incredible possibilities of someone with two of those strengths. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister, and I invite the Leader of Opposition to open the opposition case here.
we only have, on average, probably around 75 years as a human to make our mark on the world. And we buy into this conception that opening government frames of what's important in this debate, which is what's important to you as an individual and what's important in terms of your contribution to society. What we would tell you is that the important thing in terms of you as an individual is the type of legacy that you're going to have and the type of work that you do in the 75 years that you have in this life. We would tell you that it is far better to have a life where you pursue what your true passions are, given the limitations and the mortality that we live in. All of my deconstruction is going to be interwoven in 2 points I'd like to talk about. First, how passion liberates the self, and second, why art benefits the common good, buying into the framing of government. First, how passion liberates the self. First, I'd like to talk about why we prioritize the values that we have as an individual over these collectivist interests they pose to you on proposition. 2 reasons. The first reason is that we value this idea of autonomy, and they tell you in government that autonomy is a good thing. But we're going to tell you specifically that autonomy is really important, no thank you, because it is the freedom for you to choose your own path and your own mark into this world. What proposition says is that there is some sort of demand that we have, obviously, if you choose this career of being a scientist, because perhaps you could be like the best doctor in the world, maybe you can find the cure for cancer, you can do all of these things. But we would tell you that if that choice for you to become the best scientist or to become the person who cures cancer is based on a choice that is a demand of your society that you live in and being coerced into making that rather than a choice that you make for yourself, we would tell you that that decreases the quality of your life and the type of passion that you put in the specific work that you do as a scientist. But the second thing that we would tell you then is that we think you do far better work when you commit to this idea of self-actualization, right? Because committing to your passion means that this passion is specifically the fuel that incentivizes you to do that work in the first place. So we would tell you then that if you choose to be a scientist, but your heart isn't really into that, even if you have the cognitive ability to figure out new innovations or technologies, if your heart's not into it, then your imperative to do better and to create better work isn't just fueled by like your interest in seeing that work prosper, but rather how good you are at it. We would tell you that passion is a far better interest and incentive for you to do better work. But the second component of this argument about how we should prioritize passion and why it liberates the self is the danger of this collectivist mentality that opening government doesn't really explicitly say. Why is this collectivist mentality so bad? First, we would tell you is that it distracts this self and your identity for you to be able to make your own decisions, right? Because the decisions that you do aren't because of things that you internally want, but the external factors that you are born into. We think that this loss of like liberty for you to be your own person, mold your own identity in this world means you lose the limited tools that we have as human beings to really make our mark. But the second thing is that we would tell you, no thank you, that collectivist and societies punish individuals who don't conform to what we deem as, productive members of society. Why is that a bad thing? Well, when you punish individualism, we think that first of all, you lead to a society that is just literally just more bland. But second of all, you create a society that mechanizes individuals based on their ability, their technical ability to contribute to that society, rather than like their ability to fulfill their own life's passions. You get societies like Japan, where you have individuals who are so focused on studying for their prep exams, going to after-school activities, spending all their time onto trying to get to the best schools as possible. Then after they get to their degree, trying to get to the best jobs as possible, working 80 hours a week, and always losing their sight of what is actually valuable in life. When you create a society that is always focused on the work that you do, then you create a society that has high rates of depression, high rates of suicide, and ways where your loss of your individual identity leads to a worse off society in the long term. But finally, we would say this collectivist society means that you lose this ability to self-advocate. Why is that? Because you're always going to have a guilt that you have to do what is best for your society rather than what is best for yourself. And when that guilt is always going to dominate every single aspect of your actions, we would say that the final work and product that you create, even if you decide to be a scientist, is going to be completely diluted because your heart isn't really into it at the end of the day. Top half.
How do you address the fact that I frame the debate as a free decision made out of free will difficult, and this implication of coercion doesn't cohere at all with the interpretation of the motion.
Even if we buy into this idea that it is a free will, because you are making that decision, two responses. The first that we would say is that it is a decision that is coerced because of this collectiveness mentality that you're in, where you want to do things that are only best for your society, rather than things that actually fulfill yourself. But the second thing that we would say is that the info site literally says that your true passion is art. So let's talk about like two responses. So first they tell you that passion is malleable. Once again, it says your true passion is doing art and being artists. We think that even if it might change, like that is the thing that you're truly driven by. But the second thing that they say is that you can do art part-time. You don't have to do it full-time. When we tell you that you have a limited time on earth to make your legacy and make your mark, when you're spending half of your day in the laboratory or half of your day trying to research different cancer cells, and you're losing that time to make the type of art in the magnum opus that you can make to truly make your art on society for future generations, that is always going to be a loss to you as an individual. Moving on second, how this is going to benefit the common good at the end of the day. No thank you. So first, let's talk about the importance of art, right? We think that first of all, art is important because it is a mirror to society. It is a way that we can reflect of ourselves as individuals and things beyond just simple words and descriptions, but through poetry, through music. But second, we think that the importance when you choose the decision to be an artist is that you inspire other individuals to pursue the things that will lead to their other self-actualization. So if proposition says that you might have this likelihood of being the person that cures cancer, what we would tell you is that we would still have far greater benefits to inspire other individuals to be their own individual person and to live a better life. But now let's bring in the comparative out of time of why this is going to be better when you choose art versus choosing science. First, we would tell you that scientists are always going to be in demand anyway because we pay them a high amount and a high salary, so you're always still going to have scientists and research. Second, we would tell you that this rise in this capitalist mentality means that people are already under this presumption of choosing work. We say that the new presence of art and valuing art, even as a person who could have been the best scientist in the world, will inspire people to color this type of science and STEM education when you start to compare it to art. But third, we would say that art makes the scientific work and research that we do valuable. We think that this is a far better world to live in on our side. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you, Leader, for those remarks, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the government case. You're here.
The most important concept in today's debate is the weighing mechanism that my partner established at the start of his speech, and that is maximizing social benefit and maximizing the individual benefit. And the team that wins today's debate is going to be the team who understands fundamentally the trade-off between these two items and optimizes both of them. And at the end of my speech, you're going to understand why opening government achieves this feat. In my speech, I'm going to be refuting opening opposition's points and then strengthening the points my partner made in his speech. Moving to the speech of opening opposition. Their first point is that passion liberates the self, and that if we value autonomy, we should have the freedom to choose our own path. However, the motion at hand does not eradicate freedom or free will. My partner has addressed this both in his speech and in his POIs, that this motion, nowhere in this motion does it hint at the fact that this person will be coerced by the government, that this person won't have a say in what industry he or she chooses. This motion actually lets the person choose what industry they want to be a part of, and nowhere in the motion, once again, does it say you will be coerced to choose one over the other. Yes.
Right, then what the hell is the debate about? Like, the whole premise of this entire idea is that we make a choice between something that we're passionate about doing and something that is based on societal benefit, even though we don't enjoy doing that. You have to tell me how you're not just fiating every single mechanism in the debate so that you can win on all terms. Like, what do we have to debate with if that's the case?
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up because I'm going to be addressing that dichotomy in my third point, but I'm still refuting opening opposition's points. So let's move on to their second point about how you can only achieve self-actualization with this. What opening opposition is fundamentally mischaracterizing is the polarization between, quote, what you're good at and, quote, what you like. These two things are not mutually exclusive, which I'll be going over once again in my third point. Society is also not coercing the individual to benefit society and forego their individualistic interests. So their third point about how collectivism punishes people who don't conform to traditional definitions of success, that simply falls on its feet. Next, they say how people who forego their passions to pursue what they're good at lose the ability to self-advocate. Here on Open in Government, we're saying that people now have the autonomy to choose between leisure and labor. These two things, once again, are not mutually exclusive. You can practice science and you can practice art concurrently, and actually this motion allows for this individual to choose which part of leisure or which part of labor they would like to participate in. Secondly, there's no guilt in choosing the societal benefit over individual benefit, because societal benefit is simply the aggregation of individual benefits, and a person can achieve fulfillment and happiness by achieving this feat. Secondly, opening opposition goes to stereotype Japan as a dystopia and puts that awash over the whole country and says that no one in Japan uses passion to produce the amazing contributions to the world that they are in the status quo. And here on Open in Government, we'd like to say that's simply not true. Lastly, they talk about the importance of art and how we need to be inspiring more artists to continue their work. However, this person becoming a scientist doesn't take away from the fact that art is amazing and that art brings a lot of benefits to society. It doesn't diminish it in any way, and with this motion. Next, let's move on to my 3 substantive arguments that my partner brought up in his speech. First, that in whichever scientific field this individual participates in, they will be making a groundbreaking discovery, which is valuable not only to the country of their origin, but also to the international stage. They will have knowledge that's meaningful to society and that will change it in drastic ways. Let's take Professor Jenner, who created the smallpox vaccine and also the first vaccine ever created. Now, smallpox has killed 10% of all people who have ever lived to present day. Once this vaccine was globalized in society and people all over the world were receiving treatment for this groundbreaking vaccine, it prevented the death of potentially billions of people if that weren't the case. So we'd be basically missing out on our generation's Professor Jenner, someone who would rock our world in such a way. And this is what we talk about when we're maximizing society's benefits, which is, once again, the weighing mechanism of which we need to be looking at this debate through. Secondly, passion is malleable. It's not assigned to birth, and it's not inherent to human beings. There have been countless TED Talks talking about how to find your passion, and you have to create your passion. It's not something you're simply born with. Whereas if you are a genius at such a high caliber of intelligence, this is a trait, this is a gift, something that you're born with, a natural propensity to excel at something. I'll take front half's POI.
Okay, on government side, maybe you get a population that is far larger and healthier, but you have individuals living and working careers that they are wasting away because they don't actually see value in it. At least on our side, you inspire people to become fulfilled and actually value the life that they have in the limited time on
Okay,
Earth.
once again, thank you for that POI. I'll be addressing that once again in my third point. Still on point 2, that passion is malleable. So, once again, when we're talking about genius, things that make you a genius, for example, like a scientific genius, these are traits, gifts that are innate and inherent to you. Passion is something you create through time and practice. Passion for art may not be permanent for this individual in the foreseeable future. And a passion for science may already be established within this individual and may arise in the individual in the future if that's not the case. Which leads me directly into my third point, that there's no dichotomy between passion and what you're good at. These two items are not mutually exclusive. You can be a scientist and artist concurrently, and if opposition throughout the bench tries to tell you otherwise, that's fundamentally wrong. You can do art on the side, as my partner mentioned, or you could do art equally as much as you do science. This motion is simply talking about this individual pursuing science as an industry, but that's not to say that this individual could also be an artist. Let's take Steve Jobs, for example, who blended both art and his work in technology and business. He extensively practiced calligraphy in China while still innovating at an unprecedented rate in the technology field. Once again, interdisciplinarity is such a beautiful thing and actually might maximize both industries if we find the overlap between the two and are able to bridge the two worlds together. So once again, these two items about how passion is malleable and about how passion and what you're good at is not a dichotomy, it's not mutually exclusive, these two last contentions touch on the fact that the maximizing benefit to the individual can still be had with this motion passed. Thus, opening government has met the burden of maximizing social benefit and individual benefit. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for those remarks, and I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the top half. You're here.
What is our legacy, and what should it be? What my partner and I believe is that our legacy ought to be one of resistance and rebellion to what society tells us our legacy should be. That our value should not be something that is in the product that we make, but more so in our ability to live a life of personal enlightenment because we are following our heart's desire. My partner and I want us to be able, as a society, to shift this perception of what is valuable, of this dichotomy that does exist between science and art. But we believe that the best way for us to do that is to prioritize our individual self and our autonomy over this idea of society. We believe that the framework in this debate, as we need to weigh whether prioritizing society over ourselves is going to best benefit our world and ourself in the long term. We believe that we better achieve personal happiness, but better also force society to confront the way it views what value is and this dichotomy, this determinism that exists. And we think that we do that best whenever we make our life a personal ode to resistance. That is the legacy that we want in this debate. 3 points. First, I'm going to tell you about how autonomy dismantles determinism. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the religion of science. And lastly, I'm going to tell you why we need to set an example of why we ought to value art in our society. All my deconstruction will be interwoven. First, how autonomy dismantles determinism. First, we believe that determinism is viewed in our society as an overarching framework. Even the motion itself shows that there is always this conception that you were born to do something, right? Whether it's an aptitude test or simply the fact that people automatically label you, depending on whether you are more mathematically inclined or more artistically inclined, that you are right brain or left brain. There are always categories for you to fit in, and there's no ability for you to cross categories. We believe that the problem is that society always tells us what we should be constantly. They always tell us what category we ought to belong into, and this is always viewed as automatically credible because of the inherent legitimacy of society. If the world tells us it's true, then it must be true about ourselves. We think that whenever we talk about the coercion that would happen in this choice, it is not one that is like, society is not holding a gun to your head, right, and saying, be a scientist, be Joseph Salk. What it is that you're always going to feel obligated to satisfy your society. You're always going to say, I don't want to be guilty. I want to help as many people as possible because that is the only way in which my life has value. We believe that that coercion of determinism is toxic and is the reason why we see so many of the problems in our society that we do, right? My partner tells you how whenever we enforce dichotomies, like this idea of science versus art, of all of these various categories, that what that means is you feel like you don't have any control over your life. You don't have any autonomy because although your heart might say something different, your head is always going to tell you that you need to follow this societal framework because it is viewed as a religion, it is viewed as the only way in which you can actually benefit. We think the problem, right, is that this already leads to things that we can see in our society as being harmful, right? It's cubicle depression. Nobody chooses to work in a cubicle. Society tells them it is going to be the best option for them because of finances or because of all of these other bigger reasons. And the problem is that you don't feel like you have any choice in this scenario. You feel depressed. You feel worthless. Yes. Passion is malleable, but grief or guilt is not. And we believe that guilt is going to be the way these people view their lives. They're always going to have regret that they did not follow what their heart wanted. They're never going to be satisfied. And we think that's why you see an increase in suicide rates. That's why you see an increase in people who are dissatisfied
satisfied with the status quo is because it is categorical and it is broken. By choosing our heart over our head, we as an individual set an example for others that they can do this too, that they can be happy and that they don't need society to tell them what that joy looks like, that you can reject determinism and be a functional and happy human being. Not at this time. But secondly, into the religion of science and why we think that it is toxic in our society. First, science is always valued because it is perceived as being difficult, right? Art is for some reason viewed as something that you are either just that you can always learn to be better at, but math and science are always viewed as things that are inherently difficult, right? Look at the way in which people talk about artists versus the way that people talk about Nobel Prize winners, right, for science. The thing is that nobody looks at a physicist and their theorem, nobody looks at CERN, right, and says, I could do that. But people go to museums all the time and say that because it is never viewed as something valuable. It is viewed as something that they could probably achieve if they put a little bit of time into it. The problem with this is that science is always going to be valued, right? We're always going to have scientists, and so we don't think that it is personal responsibility of this individual, because there's always going to be higher wages for scientists, there's always going to be a larger employment field for scientists, and so we don't think that that's necessarily a good reason why we should view this as though we need one more scientist to add to those. But secondly, we think that this value means that you never get open in government's Renaissance person, right? Because of these stereotypes, if you are a scientist who does art, it is going to be viewed as a hobby. It is not going to be viewed as a legitimate way to actualize, versus if you are an artist who instead dabbles in science, it's going to be mind-blowing because nobody thinks that you are smart enough to be able to do that because of these stereotypes and because of the way that we view our society and the way that we view art and science. I will take top half.
How do you address the fact that to access science, you have to pursue it through an educational fashion? You can't simply enter science without, for example, a bachelor's degree or a PhD.
Exactly, right? Because people view this barrier to entry, right, that you have to be smart and pass tests and go to good schools and do lots of research. People always view this as being more respectable than somebody who might have spent the same amount of time and had the same amount of education to become an artist, because that is not viewed as legitimate in our society. The thing about opening government and this idea of a Renaissance person is that it's not a mutually exclusive idea, but your work is always going to be diluted. There's an opportunity cost, and we would rather have these people focus on art than focus on science and try and do art. No, you're out of time. But lastly, why do you think that we need to set an example as an individual that we value art? Why we need to take this step of personal resistance? Why our legacy needs to be one that says society is wrong? And we think it's because art is just a mirror to our society. Art forces us to confront ourselves and the way in which we view our society as existing. Your art can be a protest against this dichotomy. Your art can be a protest against the fact that you felt you had to choose between being a scientist and being an artist. And yes, maybe you don't ever get to live that life in which you are able to do both of these things that you care about, this thing that you have passion for, and this thing that you have the intellect and ability for. But it paves the way for somebody else down the line to be able to have both of those things, to not be categorical, to not have to exist within a dichotomy, because you have signaled to somebody, whether it's through a painting or a piece of music, that they don't have to make the same choice you made, because you can be successful and also exist within these various dichotomies. You can be someone who doesn't exist within a certain framework just because society says so. Honorable panel, we think that you need to look at yourselves as individuals and understand whether you would live a more satisfied life as being someone who chose what you wanted versus what society wanted for you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for those remarks, and I invite the member of government to extend the government case. Hear, hear.
Your chair, right?
Yes.
Okay, and cool. Greg and panel, for the purpose of this debate, you are a gifted individual. You're an amazing, fantastic gift to humanity, a prodigy. None has seen the likes of you ever before. We have to tell you why you should look at the rest of your life and make the decision to pursue science rather than art. We think that the best form of this debate is making that hardline decision. And so we're going to take that hardline stance and say, why science over art? We think that who are you? Right? You're an intelligent individual. You're a moral, caring individual. Like, you've received a generous amount from society, the fact that you've been able to be proven most intelligent. You were young and you see your whole life ahead of you. And because of that, our case is going to be telling you why passion is selfish, and what you really care about is engagement with your creation, of impacting the world. You see yourself as having an obligation to the world. But before I get into that, let's do some refutation. It comes from the opening team that determinism is toxic. We think that it actually gives great meaning to people. It answers the question that we all ask ourselves, why are we here? And the idea that destiny is highly liberating. It tells you that all those barriers that you're engaging with, those are meaningless. They don't belong there. You have the capacity to break down those barriers and become better and change the world. They give you this really weird catch-22. Because they say that you shouldn't have obligations. However, then they tell you that you have an obligation to be counterculture, that you should reject societal norms. And we think there's a problem with that. We think that they didn't tell you why necessarily art is a better societal norm, and we think that we're going to tell you why. But secondarily, we understand that they say that you're obligated to change the society. We're going to tell you that we think that you can physically change society, physically alter society in a tangible way that you can connect with in a far better way than their world. And thirdly, they tell you you're obligated to inspire. We understand that we give meaning to things by the physical actions we take, right? Life has meaning because we save it. And we think at that point we can be just as inspiring, and I think by the actions that scientists take are going to be just as inspiring, and I'm going to tell you why the value of why they think they should pursue art is actually going to undercut the value and the meaning of art entirely, because passion is selfish, thus art for selfish purposes is bad. So let's talk about why is passion selfish? Right? We understand that, first of all, it's fleeting and can be manufactured. So we want to talk about, because it's been highly contested on the upside, but we ask you, think back to your first significant other. Right? You're passionate, you're in love. But that faded, right? It changed. Your life changed. There's some people who have that constant, but you have to understand that those things that you're in love with, that you thought can be nothing else, it can be influenced by small things. It can leave just as fast because it is your desires, your biology going forth. Secondarily, we think that passion is inherently self-centered. Even people that are, say, passionate about charity or for caring other people, they want it to feel good. They want it to feel better about themselves. They go into that. We think, for a counterexample, people who feel the obligation to be charitable are far better at it because they understand that it serves not themselves but something outside themselves. Thirdly, we think that passion can be constructed. Right? They brought up the TED Talks. That's exactly what I watched. And we understand that passion is created by learning about something, about applying yourself. They brought up the example about someone who's been a steel worker for 15 years. And I think that it's really important to remember that an individual in that is you have to apply yourself to want to love it, to want to engage with it. Just doing something repetitively doesn't create passion, but it's that desire, that greater meaning to it. And we think that fourthly, passion does not create fulfillment. Right? It's a mechanism to do so. It's a selfish mechanism. You acquire, say, love or a job through passion. We think that's what it acts as, a selfish vehicle to achieve something. And we think that selfish nature fundamentally alters it and changes the composition. We think that you shouldn't be selfish, right? We're just going to say it. We think that all that you take, or I think a quote that my dad used to say is that all that you take with you is what you give away. Right? You can't carry on some pieces of art that you make, and you don't want to what do you want to pass on to your kids? Some scientific achievement, some change in the fundamental structure. We think that there's something more than what you want. There's something else outside of that. So what do you want? Right, Greg? What do you want, Greg? You want engagement with your creation, right? We think that physically altering and changing reality, which science demands, right, is that you're taking the composition of all that we see and you're physically changing it and creating something better. Like you add tangible addition to the world, like the metaphysical that they're talking about, the idea that art is an ethereal meaning, right? Yes, you make a painting, whatnot, but you don't actively change the composition because the meaning from art is derived from perception. It's never from, yourself at that point. It's about how the world looks around you. And we think that staticness actually, keeps the contribution from being successful. Top.
Okay, so buying into this collectivist mentality of things that you're doing to better other people means there's always going to be a pervasive guilt that you're not good enough for society. At least on our side, you know what makes you happy, and we have a far better certainty of that fulfillment.
I don't think you do know what makes you happy, right? Like I'll go to get a Big Mac or something, and I thought that'd make me happy. It doesn't. We think that people are really bad, but what we think is rather you have been given a gift, right? Because we need to talk about obligations. At the point of the gift you have been given, I think that obligation is what gives you value. You are here for a very special reason, right? You are been ascribed the reason you are better than everyone else. When you look back on your life, right, that knowing that you chose their side and squandered the gift, the opportunity to fundamentally change reality and interact with that reality every day, we think you're going to regret it. You're going to look at your decisions, look at your passions. You're going to look back at your 30s when you started collecting, Cabbage Patch dolls. Or you're going to look back at your 40s when you bought a few boats, right? You're going to look at your passions over time and realize they were fleeting. But if you look back on our side, you're going to see a world where you contributed, where you can look to your kids and saying, I made your world better. I solved a disease. I created a vaccine. I altered reality in a way that makes it better for you. So that is why you should definitely vote Greg for closing up.
Thank the member for those remarks and invite the member of opposition to extend the opposition case. Here.
Opening government makes an important observation about this debate, and that is that in the InfoSlide, in the context, in the world in which this exists, people have a choice to make, right? What that means is that this debate is not just about whether or not you decide to become an artist, something that is probably likely to make you happy, or whether or not you want to become a scientist, which is something that is likely to be productive. It is a decision about whether or not you want to affirm the aptitude test that decided whether or not you should make those decisions in the very first place. It is about clearly a system or some sort of institution that decided what moral productivity and assigning value to other individuals based on your own productive capacity often means. The entirety of this debate thus so far has assumed that the people designing this aptitude test are making good decisions about what a moral obligation is in the first place. We tell you that this man, this woman, this person who is making this decision has a crucial choice to make, and holds an extreme position of prominence once they make it. Given that, they should reject this aptitude test and send a message to the system that designed it in the very first place to reject these moral paradigms in the first place. 2 points of construction here. First, let's talk about rejecting the mindset that this aptitude test affirms, moving beyond this bland discussion about whether or not making art makes you happy, whether or not being a scientist is good or not. These arguments exist whether or not making the art makes you happy, which means we can circumvent most of the stuff from opening government, then we'll get to CG later. Then we're going to tell you how making this decision is important, how it delegitimizes and deconstructs the societal attitudes that created this aptitude test in the first place, and reject the government legitimacy that we've given it in the first place. So, first, on rejecting the mindsets. What is the nature of the society that exists in the InfoSlide and presumably the world that we're talking about, right? It is one where this aptitude test is clearly powerful. It is one where it is deterministic, not only of what you do, but of what moral attributes you assign to other people based on the decisions that they make. It was designed, presumably, by some set of individuals, an institution, perhaps a government, I hope not corporations, that decided whether or not scientists creating some sort of scientific innovation and helping kids with cancer was a good thing. And that's the low-hanging fruit on their side of the house, like helping kids with cancer. But the question in this debate is whether or not the people in different worlds, or in different worlds where we could envision, are making the same sorts of decisions about what is moral and what is not. CG tells you that your value comes from whether or not you hold moral obligations to other people and whether or not you help them. The question I'm going to ask to you, Tyler, is who gets to make those decisions about what is moral and what is not? It is a government. Oh my goodness. Is it a liberal government in 2018, or is it the United States in 1950? Is it an authoritarian government that exists somewhere that makes decisions based on whether or not you were enslaved to a system that forces you to be productive in ways that are immoral? Does it force you to make the sorts of trade-offs that are necessarily going to harm other individuals or put people into a position of structural oppression? We do not know, because you cannot feel out the sorts of decisions that are made on your side of the house based on whether or not they are morally neutral or morally positive or morally negative. That's incredibly important, right? Because what that means is that you are reinforcing this infinitely regressive idea of productivity, right? A world of perfect utility where everyone does the perfect thing for other people so that they can be perfect is useless unless people are happy, right? That's why on a fundamental level you should choose to make the art, because it is something that is more likely to make you happy. But regardless of whether or not this was an artist or someone who was like doing really whatever that could exist in this sort of debate, it is mainly premised on the idea that you should enjoy your experience because it defines your existence. Because when other people decide that for you constantly, forever, until the end of time, it robs us of our ability to define what our own experience in this very world is, and reifies a system of government that decides to strip us of our rights whenever they decide to, with whatever resources they have available to them, in whatever moral world they decide to exist in. It might be good, it might be bad. We say reject that system entirely because it is a bad way to run the world. They say the scientific innovation is good. We say you shouldn't use people as a means to your end, which might be morally positive or might be morally negative. They tell you that we can just do both. I think this is a pretty lazy argument insofar as being a really successful scientist and making huge contributions to the world probably requires you to trade off your time, which means you don't get the Renaissance analysis stuff you get from the Deputy Prime Minister. Given that, why is it important that this individual makes a specific decision, right? Because it's clear that this sort of aptitude test has created some sort of extraordinary result, like this person placed first. It's very likely that the intention is going to be focused on them once they decide what to do. We say reject it, go public, give a critique against the government, and start that conversation, right? Create a moral discussion about what defines our existence. Awaken others to the moral trance that they have been in for the last 100 years since the introduction of things like late capitalism. Delegitimize the aptitude test so other people don't have to make the same fucked up decision that you did in the first place. Back half.
Okay, so like I said, Greg, you're an intelligent and caring individual. You know that you're freaking awesome. You don't need the government test. That was just some weird modeling thing for the motion. So vote on that. And after you've done this critique, what do you do next? Science or art?
That was possibly the laziest POI I've ever gotten, right? Like, the entire premise of this extension is that the moral decisions that you are basing what you are going to do or not going to do are decided by an overarching system that delivers you a test based on what you should do, which means it doesn't matter whether or not you have a moral rejection as to whether or not you're going to do something or not. The government and the society that is constructed around it has told you what is good and what is bad. You deliver arguments based on the idea that some things are morally neutral or are morally positive. We say that is impossible given the world that was set up by the opening government and the lack of fiats that you get to make as to how that world is actually created. Choosing science reifies the sort of system that you force yourselves to constantly reenact yourself in and play over and over and over again until we all fall off the earth and die, or until climate change consumes our world and we have to move to Mars. I don't know what's going to happen first, but given the fact that until we come to that time, I think it's important that people make decisions for themselves. People decide what defines their own existence and their own happiness. I think it's incredibly harmful that given that we are getting no answer so far. Oh, I was going to take you guys. It's okay. You get no answer as to whether or not this world exists in what kind of moral world, right? So given the fact that this aptitude test is incredibly important, given the fact that it's unlikely, or it's at least very unclear, whether or not the people who designed it are making morally good decisions as to what is productive and what is good, and given the results of that are incredibly likely to be variant in many different sorts of societies and many different types of government, I think it's better to err on the side of caution and err on the side of preserving your fundamental existence and engaging in self-defense against the government that is very likely to make bad decisions for you, and you're very unlikely to decide whether or not those are good or bad. That means you should reject this government, reject the test, go public, delegitimize the aptitude test so other people don't have to live in the same cage, in the same prison that you do.
Thank the member for those remarks, and I invite the government whip to conclude the government case here.
So Greg, the point at which you must make your decision is looming. What do you do? We think that we on side government have given you a very convincing case as to why you as the individual making this decision should choose to become a scientist. We're very, very happy to propose. So before I get into like the kind of analysis, well, I mean, I suppose this whole thing is an analysis, right? But let's kind of look at like what's been thrown around, right? OG came up here today, but actually, sorry, before that, let me refute the previous speaker, right? They seem to paint this dystopian vision, right, in which this aptitude test is a means by which an oppressive government is ascribing meaning to you, right? But we say 4 things to that, right? 1, you're making the decision, right? I mean, you have autonomy, you have the ability to make that decision under our framework, so we think it's kind of strange, right, that we use this frame of coercion, right? 2, right, if you're smart, right, if you have the ability to actually become a scientist, right, and you know it, surely you have a moral obligation to actually realize that, right? Surely there is a sense of meaning that comes from that obligation, which I'll get onto, right? And Tyler talks a lot about this, right? To do so, right? And 3, right? It's also fair to say that morality is something also that rather morality does exist, right? That some things are inherently good, right? That becoming a scientist in order to give tangible benefits to society, right, is something that is objectively good, right? And it's better than pursuing selfish desire, right? And also 4, right? Let's say that we take them at their best and say, yeah, we're going to stick it up to the man and that we're going to delegitimize everything, right, that the government stands for, right? But then now what? Then what do? Do you become a scientist or do you pursue art, right? So I was, kind of perplexed at their case. But let's move on to kind of like what you got from this round, Greg, right? Because OG came up here with basically, 3 things, right? They came up here and said, 1, that that it's not really mutually exclusive. You could still pursue science and you could, dabble in art, right? And yeah, that's true. You don't necessarily have to be. It's not mutually exclusive. That's true, right? But at the same time, we accept that, but we also want to debate on the premise that, okay, what if it is mutually exclusive, right? Because that's kind of what this debate is about. And Tyler kind of extended that. That was a unique extension. So he came up here and kind of told you that, right? He also, and then OG also came up and told you that passion is something that's malleable, right? And yeah, again, it is malleable. We accept that, right? But also Tyler went further than that and told you that passion is also something inherently evil and bad and something that we shouldn't be valuing. In the better paradigm, right? They also, so Tyler also extended the idea that we should pursue the maximization of societal benefits, right? That how being a scientist is better than being an artist, right? I mean, objectively. OG kind of got to this, but they didn't really tell you why art it was inherently worse than science, right? So, and then I think again Tyler kind of told you why science was a better value here. So we think that we did come up with substantive extensions. Now, before I get on to the opening opposition case, sure, I can.
So true, you have a decision to make, but the point is that the system coerces you or significantly influences which one you're going to make. I.e., I go to a restaurant, I don't really want to tip because I want to keep more money in my pocket, but the social circumstances around me are going to choose to make me one decision. That's the point of the extension, is that you have very little free will in your world.
What is the mechanism for this social circumstance, though? I mean, because you're saying that this test is ascribing this value to you, right? But we're saying that as an individual, the value and meaning is derived from something that's far more transcendent than that, right? And far better than that. And we will get onto that and why Tyler kind of proved that to you. But before that, right, let's kind of talk about the opening opposition's case, right? They talked about this idea of having a legacy, right? And how, under their paradigm, you're going to get this liberation of self, how quality of life is going to go up. But again, these are under the false assumptions of coercion, right? That you're somehow making this decision out of coercion, in which Tyler and actually OG kind of dismantled for you, right? They also talked about this idea of autonomy, right? And how that dismantles determinism, right? But really, right, that kind of gives us meaning, because obligation by virtue of your abilities, right? I mean, it gives us a deep sense of meaning. I mean, if I were in your position, Greg, right, and I was fantastic at one thing, right, and it had the potential to save and impact the world, surely, right, you would feel called to do that, right? Even if you don't believe in God, even if you don't believe in a power that is outside of yourself, right, that's giving you that meaning, surely you would believe that, you would want to believe that that is something that you were created to do, right? So that's why we think that's far better than something that's fleeting, like passion, right? Because Tyler did come up here, right, and tell you that passion is actually something that's incredibly bad. It's not something that they're really challenged, right, on their side of the house, right? Because they talked about, simply following our heart. That will lead to self-actualization. That will lead to meaning. That will lead to everyone being happy, right? That will lead to you being happy, Greg, right? But in reality, passion is something that's incredibly fleeting, right? Just as Tyler described his experience with his first girlfriend, right? Our desires do change, right? Our desires do, they are self-created, and they're based on feeling. They're based on our biological instincts, right? And sure, why not? Yeah.
Selfishness and passion is viewed as unethical in our society because of determinism. Why should we promote a world that views choice as an affront to that society? And why does choice give us any less meaning than determinism does?
Well, we're not saying that, it's not mutually exclusive though. We have choice on our side of the house too, right? We're just saying that it's far better to follow something that is transcendent and larger than yourself than something that you feel like, right? And that's kind of what we're getting at, right? Because it is based on feeling, right? And passion doesn't create fulfillment, right? It's just as Tyler described to you. I mean, when I go and eat, that does, when I'm hungry, I think that it makes me happy, but of course that's not going to make me happy, right? I'm sure you can, that resonates with you as well, Greg, right? But so, passion doesn't create fulfillment, right? And it fundamentally also changes the value of what you're creating, because when art, and Tyler kind of got to this too, right? But when art is created as a result of selfish desire, it ceases to become art, right? Or to be art, right? He also told you that tangible physical change versus arbitrary change is better, because meaning is something that comes from the physical world. We think it's far better to be the creator of that physical world. So we're very, very happy to propose today. Thank you.
Thank you, Government Whip, and I invite the opposition whip to conclude the opposition case in the debate.
So you got existentialists in opening opposition, and then you got the postmodernists in closing, right? That is to say, opening opposition tells you, screw what everybody else says, do what makes you happy. And closing opposition says, look, there's a fundamental problem in the fact that anybody is ever telling you what is best and what is an obligation in the first place. We don't actually care if art makes you happy or not. We don't actually care if art is going to bring you to fulfillment. All we care about is that we live in a terrible society where an aptitude test exists in the first place, where our own definition of what's good can be defined by a government test that's passed down upon us, and the only way to deconstruct that test is to be the person that says, hey, look, I was going to be the greatest scientist ever. I said screw it because tests suck, and that's not what I want to do with my life. 3 questions. First question, whether government can have their cake and eat it too. Because there's this really annoying tendency from both government teams to be like, look, we can have passions and we can have obligations, right? We can do science and we can do art. We can force science to be our passion because there's obviously this really, really good TED Talk that I haven't gotten around to watching. All right, meta debate to clear out something that the Prime Minister said, right? The Prime Minister's like, look, because I've modeled this debate as we having free will, this means no coercion ever obtained, and all of opposition's arguments go out the window. Little bit of meta debate. We, the House, are deciding whether or not we are going to become the artist or the scientist, right? Therefore, we have to consider within that decision, which will be made by free will when the judge decides who wins this round, whether or not coercive factors should be implemented into our decision. No thinking, right? Opening government also tells us, look, you can do art on the side. Robert told you, scientists who make substantial additions to their fields, like opening government also characterizes for you, literally do not have time to do works of art, right? If you become a Nobel Prize winner, you are working 50-hour weeks in undergrad to be at the top of your class to get to the best PhD program, and then after that doing research for your entire life, right? You're not having time to legitimately create a craft of art. We don't think that that's legitimate on their side of the house, right? Then opening government and closing government tell us look, We don't really care if art is true passion in the info slide, because true passion doesn't exist and we can make anything our passion, right? Despite this TED Talk, which I don't think should be authoritative in this BP universe, right? I see this in many cases to be empirically false. I know individuals have been doing something for years and years and years and aren't satisfied with it. Why is this the case, right? If I could really just make my passion anything, I would go do the easiest thing possible and just make it my passion, right? I would make eating Twinkies all day my passion, because that can be fulfilled doing something really, really stupid, right? We just don't think that this is necessarily true. All right. Second question, whether or not art is better for society. Opening opposition gave you two, art or science is better for society. Opening opposition gave you two reasons that they think art might be better for society. The first is that social productivity is infinitely regressive, right? That is to say, if everybody's deciding whether or not what's best for society and not what's best for them, nobody's going to be happy because they're going to be working making other people happy, right? That just doesn't work. It's contradictory on a principled level, right? The second reason they're giving is because not pursuing your passion, or pursuing your passion makes you less likely to kill yourself, right? You might be a really, really sad scientist, and you might get really depressed and kill yourself. This is some of the impacts we get out of opening opposition, right? But we ask on closing opposition, why is it that we see science as more productive in the first place, right? Robert tells you it's really the social zeitgeist of our time, right? The medieval time wouldn't care about science at all, right? The fallacy is that thinking our time is right about what is productive and what is not, right? Robert gives the scenario of what would these aptitude tests look like in the 1950s, right? Would women have to take a separate aptitude test that had nothing about jobs on it, but only about domestic activities, right? We're not in the 1950s. Obviously, we have it all perfect right now, so our aptitude tests would be good and liberal, right? 50 years from now, they might look back at 2018 and look at that horrible place, right? Robert told you the legitimate reality is political institutions create these aptitude tests, and they're going to be based upon whatever the society sees as right at that time, and that might not necessarily be the correct thing. My POI to opening government was very intentional. I don't think it was answered right. Why is groundbreaking research into marine biology really that good? It's just the response of the Prime Minister is I don't think we have to defend why finding knowledge is good. I don't care if we learn something new about porpoises. Honestly, go look up scientific research that exists out there. There's so many stupid things that are advances in knowledge that I quite frankly do not care about, right? I don't think necessarily doing groundbreaking research on whether or not the porpoise blowhole blows at 50 miles per hour or 100 miles per hour is necessarily that good. Now look, that's a little bit uncharitable. They might find something that's probably a little bit better than that. But the simple fact of the matter is, we don't necessarily think that even if they find some of the greatest scientific discoveries in the world, that would be necessarily that good. In medieval times, they'd be we don't care about curing cancer, we want to know the 5 proofs for God so we can convert atheists. They didn't care about health back then, they cared about going to heaven. Why is it that when we care about health now, that we're right and they were wrong? Robert tells you there's no reason to believe so, right? So what's the answer? The answer is, in a world of complete external vagary, we really should just follow our hearts. And this is honestly, this is going to sound really dumb, but we're just going to say there's not really any way to know what our moral obligations are, what we should be doing. We should just follow what our emotional passions are, because that's the greatest and most real direction that we have. Phenomenologically, it's the only direction that exists within our own mind space, and that is why we think that we should do it, right? Then let's get on the closing government's distinction that they give us, right? Because they want to come up with an extinction that makes science and reality better than art. And that is, science changes the world and art changes perception. What's more real about the world than our perception, right? If art can literally change the way I look at the world, I would see that as the greatest freaking thing on the planet, right? Imagine if you watched a movie and then everything looked different afterwards, right? And I think sometimes this does happen. We watch a movie and it colors our mood in a certain way. We don't think that just changing the world is the good measure here. Third question, whether doing science is an obligation. Robert, did you take opening or closing?
No idea.
Okay, I'm gonna take opening.
So your entire premise that in the medieval times, knowledge production was bad or problematic, 1950s, knowledge production was bad, problematic. By your very logic, we should never be producing any logic in any time because future perceptions will perceive it to be bad.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not. Or at least we shouldn't consider that as the most productive thing to do. We certainly shouldn't create tests that say that that's what aptitude means, and and the test literally, why don't we make tests that test your aptitude about whether or not you play ping pong, right? The very fact that this test is centered so it tests things like science, math, and engineering is indicative of what's important about the time. We think in different times that test is going to make different things important in a different order. Whether doing science is an obligation in this case. Okay, Robert told you that recognizing this as an obligation implies that whatever the government has defined as aptitude has some metaphysical obligation carried with it. And we think this is incredibly dangerous. Whenever you start thinking that these kinds of rules that exist in my society are the rules that exist for everyone for all time in God's eye view, we see that as incredibly dangerous. Robert says, actually we have the opposite obligation exists, right? When we exist in a world where society is creating an aptitude test that literally quantifies our worth based upon whatever their day is decided equals aptitude, we have the obligation to say screw it, right? Because this is why we're not the existentialists and we're the postmodernists, right? We don't care about being happy. What we care about is deconstructing the crappy world that exists right now and making sure that people can be actually authentic. Very, very, very proud.
I'd like to thank all the debaters. Just as a reminder, this is closed adjudication, so unfortunately we won't be able to share our thoughts with you so much later, but please go enjoy the rest of your evening in Seattle.